This was the second successful intercontinental ballistic missile test within the past month, and it flew longer and farther than any previous missile. Analysts do believe that the missile launched today did have the range to hit Los Angeles, Chicago, or even New York.
On June 12th, President Trump and Kim Jong-un met for the first time. As both leaders were threatening to annihilate each other's countries just months ago, much of the world has viewed this meeting as a success simply because it took place and because there is now an actual dialogue instead of such threats.
Move on to those high-level talks between North Korea and the U.S. appearing to hit a major snag tonight.
The North Koreans slamming the U.S. in a statement, saying they pushed a, quote, unilateral and gangster-like demand for denuclearization. There were hopes for progress after that historic summit just over a month ago. Now the talks seemingly in shambles.
Despite early optimism, these all-important negotiations are hitting a potential breakdown. There is fear the crisis may revert back to an extremely dangerous confrontation. Yet media coverage has stunningly failed to ask the most critical question of all. Why has North Korea sacrificed its economy over decades to build these nuclear weapons in the first place? There is a history inextricably connected to the present confrontation. This program steps into that vacuum to answer this key question, and in so doing it also becomes clear why North Korea is insisting on a peace treaty before it dismantles its nuclear arsenal. One does not need to look far to find the answer. It is revealed in 17 words spoken by U.S. General Curtis LeMay.
The United States Air Force destroyed every town and city in North Korea.
The overmatched Air Force and air defense of North Korea were quickly overwhelmed, giving U.S. bombers almost total control of airspace. It was said the sky over North Korea was their safe front yard. Without significant opposition, U.S. forces engaged in a relentless firebombing and burning down of cities to the point where U.S. Bomber Commander General Emmett O'Donnell made this statement in testimony to Congress.
You say that for practical purposes, we leveled every major city in North Korea so that they all looked like Berlin at the close of World War II. Well, why, am I alone in never having known this?
It's probably one of the worst episodes of unrestrained American violence against another people. But it's certainly the one that the fewest Americans know about. But when you go to North Korea, it was the first thing my guides brought up with me. For this book, did some research on how incendiary bombing developed during World War II. First the Germans did it, and then everybody did it, but especially the British and Americans. And they found out, after a lot of trial and error, that it was a lot easier to burn down a city than it was to use conventional bombs on a factory.
Fatality studies converge on the staggering number of 1 million civilians killed by U.S. bombing during the Korean War, one of the largest losses of non-combatant civilians within the last 100 years. One can only partially grasp the magnitude by comparing it to the far more well-known tragedy of atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when around 200,000 civilians perished. The news media, which was in wartime mode, did not cover this story. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Charles Hanley recounts how esteemed radio reporter Edward R. Murrow tried to file a story on what he called dead valleys in Korea. It was never broadcast. Unable to present their concerns in an official setting, eyewitness survivors, human rights attorneys, and others who believed that an atrocity against civilians had been committed organized their own tribunal to examine this issue in New York City in 2001.
These are acts that are crimes against peace. These are acts that are crimes against humanity. I ask you to find the United States guilty on these counts.
On top of this devastating wipeout of civilians, the U.S. also threatened to use nuclear weapons against North Korea. For a full 33 years, from 1958 to 1991, North Korea had to live under the shadow of U.S. nuclear weapons based right next to them in South Korea.
He has been very threatening, beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before.
What most Americans don't realize is that the thing about the fire and fury that North Korea would never witness as the world has witnessed before, that is actually completely historically inaccurate. North Korea did experience fire and fury. The US had threatened to use nuclear weapons, even though they used it against Japan and Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But they had threatened, Truman threatened to use it during the Korean War. But as many historians who covered that war show that it was so badly carpet bombed, 80% of North Korean cities were completely destroyed, that North Korea did experience it. Their pursuit of a nuclear weapon has very much, because of that experience, of that lived experience,
The United States is the country that first produced nuclear weapons and the only country that actually used it, massacring hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. The very reason the DPRK had to possess nuclear weapons is because of the US, and it had to strengthen and develop its nuclear force onto the current level to cope with the US. The US hostile policy and nuclear threats have continued over 70 years, and these have led the situation on the Korean Peninsula to a touch-and-go point. Our national nuclear force is, to all intents and purposes, a war deterrent for putting an end to nuclear threat of the US and for preventing its military invasion.
The press really doesn't talk much at all about what North Korea is actually seeking. It just sort of portrays them as this sort of, insane, attacker of the United States, whereas the U.S. is this kind of innocent bystander in Korea. And the portrayal is completely ridiculous. Yeah. U.S. and South Korea have massive war games. They're the biggest war games in the world.
For over 20 years, the United States and South Korea have engaged in massive war drills right outside the territory of North Korea. As these drills often include practice for actions aimed specifically at destroying the leadership of North Korea, it has felt severely threatened. Those who have followed the Korea issue for decades believe we are in an incredibly dangerous moment, far more frightening than is understood by the vast majority of the American people. They fear the two sides are locking into a collision course where a single spark, even one that is accidental, could trigger an unstoppable escalation into a catastrophic loss of life not seen since World War II and the First Korean War. Some worry that with North Korea fearing a strike aimed at destroying its leadership, a panic button will be pushed that leads to the launching of nuclear weapons. Some say a path to a negotiated settlement is possible.
I think we have to understand where the North Koreans are coming from, and we have to recognize that they are not maniacs, they are not madmen. I mean, I think Bill Perry recently said, in fact, they're very reasonable and they're very logical. And even Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, when she went to North Korea to meet Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, she said, this is a regime that we can negotiate with. And so that's where we need to bring it back to.
General Clark, in ceremonies at the UN base camp in Munsan, signed 6 copies of the document which would end the bloodshed. There was excitement, but little rejoicing.
We have stopped the shooting, and it will allow some of the grievous wounds of Korea to heal. Therefore, I am thankful. The task now is to put the ceasefire agreement into full effect and get down to working out an enduring settlement of the Korean problem.
The nuclear arsenal of North Korea was built to act as a deterrent to prevent the kind of devastation inflicted by the U.S. during the Korean War. This mind-boggling loss of civilians is indelibly etched into the memory of that country. It is why North Korea insists that the U.S. formally end the state of war that is still ongoing today and sign a peace treaty before it relinquishes the nuclear weapons seen as the last resort defense against the U.S. If the U.S. does not grasp the historic driving force behind the push for nuclear weapons, then it will very likely not be prepared to grant the changes that can allow North Korea to feel secure in their absence, and the talks will likely collapse.
Really great term together, great relationship.
Though the mind-boggling scale of civilian deaths from firebombing has been acknowledged by U.S. commanders, most of the world, and especially the people of the U.S., have remained unaware. Acknowledgement of this fact actually has the power to stop a nuclear catastrophe with countless casualties. In this dire situation, a special role is held by the news media. While it does not make policy decisions, it does have a responsibility to report all facts that are pertinent to those decisions. Even though the telling of this historical truth can indeed prevent disaster, coverage has essentially been non-existent. By immersing itself in day-to-day developments and the action-reaction dynamic, rather than stepping back to show the larger background context of this crisis, the biggest story regarding this summit is in the process of being completely missed. If current perceptions are not challenged by the historical truth, and the present crisis descends into a catastrophic war, this colossal failure by the media will absolutely be counted as a major contributing factor. This program is an appeal to news media to recapture this history and bring it to the American people before it is too late.
Donald Trump today. Let's listen to him back in 1999. Watch this.
First, I'd negotiate. I would negotiate like crazy, and I'd make sure that we tried to get the best deal possible. The biggest problem this world has is nuclear proliferation. And we have a country out there in North Korea, which is sort of wacko, which is not a bunch of dummies, and they are going out and they are developing nuclear weapons. And they're not doing it because they're having fun doing it. They're doing it for a reason. And wouldn't it be good to sit down and really negotiate something?
The world is watching and looking for hope. Will the most fortified border wall in existence today finally be brought down?